Oh, I'm sorry. I'll never do it again. One of the things I'm trying to show in the book is just how much Christians at this time were able to change the world. As Sir Thomas Bertram said, the future must be uncertain. There has to be something deeper for her books to be so popular for so long with so many people.
Hello, and today I'm going to be interviewing Brenda Cox. Brenda has recently published a new book. Well, tell us about the book. What's it called, Brenda?
Well, the book, you see that on Andrew's screen, but the book is Fashionable Goodness, Christianity in Jane Austen's England. And it's really about all aspects of the church in Austen's time and in her England. So starts out by talking about the church in Austen's life and in her novels, and tells you all about the Church of England in that time, the clergy and their lives and their wives and their responsibilities, and just many aspects of the church in Austen's England. And then it goes into a lot more of the historical background. So it gives the challenges that the church was facing at that time, and then ways that the church was reaching out to the world and trying to make goodness fashionable, which is where I got my title, Fashionable Goodness.
Fashionable Goodness. It's a wonderful title. I love it. When is that from Jane Austen, that particular phrase?
It's not from Jane Austen. It's from what was called the Clapham sect at that time, the group led by William Wilberforce.
Yes.
They were actually trying to make goodness fashionable. So they talked about fashionable goodness.
Excellent. And so the book has recently been published. So that was published in, was it September or October 2022, which is when we're recording. We're recording this in October.
The official launch was yesterday,
Oh,
October 20th.
Brilliant.
But I did have some advance copies out for the JASNA AGM at the beginning of the month. So we were able to offer it to people at our annual general meeting of the Jane Austen Society of North America, which
Excellent.
I was one of the many speakers at that. And so it was a good opportunity to share it with other Jane Austen fans.
And it'll be available on Amazon. Is it available in Kindle form?
It's available on Amazon in print and Kindle all around the world, wherever Amazon can put it.
Brilliant. So. That's really good. And I was fortunate enough to get a digital advance copy. So thank you, Brenda. So I've already read pretty much all of it. And it's, well, do you mind holding it up again for the camera?
Yeah, sure.
And then just turn it on its side, because it's like 400 pages. It's quite a tome, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. So all credit to you for producing something which has clearly been a labor of love for how long? I mean, when did you start this?
Almost 10 years ago, I started.
Wow.
I actually wanted to write a novel based on one of Jane Austen's novels, as your wife does so well, and other people. But I found that I really wanted to include the church in that novel, and I couldn't find all the information that I needed. So I started digging and digging and digging, and finally realized that there needed to be a resource book that would tell us all about the church in that time. So that's when I started writing it.
Right, so 10 years of work has gone into that, and it's and there's a lot of detail in there. I have to say, it is remarkably thorough. So who's it written for? I mean, who do you think is going to pick it up and read it, or download it onto their Kindle and read it?
Well, I'm hoping that any Jane Austen fans, which of course is lots and lots of all kinds of people, will pick it up and enjoy it, all the way from, I've tried to make it so that it's solidly researched so that Jane Austen scholars can appreciate it and use it, but it's also, I hope, very readable for just normal Jane Austen fans like myself. So a whole range of Jane Austen people. And I've also gotten some interest from people who are just interested in church history and in the church and its impact on the world, those kind of things. So a range of people.
Excellent. So, I mean, and it is very well researched. I mean, there are 4 or 5 pages of bibliography. So the bibliography where you're quoting all the various sources that you've looked at and other books. I mean, you've spent 10 years. That's a lot of reading and a lot of research and travel as well. And
yes.
So how often do you come to England?
Well, more often before COVID, but
yes.
But I've been several times on basically research tours of England and visited various churches and libraries and done research there.
Yeah, so I mean, there have been some great endorsements for the book. I mean, I've got things here
Very
such as
thankful for that.
meticulously researched, faultlessly organized, and engaging study of how religion in all its forms features in Jane Austen's world, her life, and of course, her writings. And that's a quote from part of a longer testimonial from Deborah Barnum, author of websites Jane Austen in Vermont. Jane Austen in Vermont? Did Jane Austen go to Vermont?
No, but there are lots of Jane Austen fans in Vermont, apparently.
Absolutely, absolutely. Roger E. Moore, he sounds almost a bit James Bond, writes, Brenda Cox's Fashionable Goodness is an indispensable guide to all things religious in Jane Austen's world. And Brenda's very kindly offered to come and talk to me today and answer some questions, as she's already been doing, about her book. So what was the most surprising thing for you as you researched this? What was the biggest surprise to you, Brenda?
Well, one surprising thing was the place of women in the church at this time, because we usually think of this time as being very restrictive for women, and yet there were a couple of women who really made a big impact on the church and on the world during this time. One of them was the Countess of Huntingdon, who became a Methodist, actually, and wanted to support the Methodist movement. And so she built she built small houses with big chapels all around the country. So just like the Rushworth family in Mansfield Park, she could build a chapel that was associated with her house. So she built these chapels specifically so the Methodists could come and preach there and reach a lot of people. And then there was another woman who was a writer like Jane Austen. Hannah More is her name. And she just had an amazing impact on England through all of her writings. And she came actually from a lower middle class background. She was the daughter of a schoolmaster in a small town. But she was apparently very witty and intelligent, and the upper classes just loved her. And she wrote these books attacking their immoral lifestyles, and they just ate them up. They went through edition after edition. And it's just amazing how she impacted the world as a woman who was considered, she wasn't, of course, a clergyman, because women could not be ordained as clergymen, but she was considered a leader among Christians at that time. She also started Sunday schools, which changed her whole area of the country from being really lost in poverty and misery, and brought people education and brought them out of all that. So it's amazing what women at this time were able to do.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, women figure very highly in the Bible, in the New Testament stories as well, don't they, with Jesus?
Yes.
So there's a great sort of thread running through that. So Jane Austen and the church. Obviously, Jane Austen features clergymen in all of her 6 books, doesn't she? Did they make it, and did they get into Sanditon? I think Sanditon is a fragment, isn't it? I don't know whether the clergyman got into the fragment. We're not talking about the television version of Sanditon, which is entirely nothing like the book.
Right. No, there aren't clergymen in Sanditon, and but there might have been later on. Of course, we don't know where she.
We don't know her plans.
But
for
it
that,
seems like she was, and I was just reading some commentator who was saying that it looks like she was criticizing the very secular, like totally commercial, let's develop this town to make money kind of view, rather than traditional towns that were actually centered around the church. And we don't know anything about the church in Sanditon, or whether there even was one. We don't know. Yeah,
I mean, I would love to have her to have finished that. Well, we all would have loved her to have finished Sanditon, but I particularly live in Weymouth, which is a seaside town, and it would have been great to get her full take on the world of fashionable seaside. Because of course Weymouth was where the king came to visit during the time of Jane Austen, and Cassandra, Jane Austen's sister, came here as well. So there are clergymen throughout all of the books. But which of the books do you think that Jane Austen wrote has the strongest focus on the church in her time?
Oh, that would be Mansfield Park, easily. In Mansfield Park, there are whole discussions about the role of the clergyman, which Edmund says had a role which responsible for everything of the most importance to mankind, of the first importance to mankind, he says. Although, of course, the Crawfords don't agree with that assessment. He has discussions with Henry Crawford about about preaching and about leading church services. They have a whole discussion about that. There's just repeated discussions in Mansfield Park about the church. And then we have Fanny Price, who a lot of people don't like, but she stood up for what she thought was right. She was physically weak, but morally she was very strong, because if she believed something was right, she stood for it against all opposition. So she didn't want to marry what she thought of as an immoral man, which would be Henry Crawford, and who we find out was an immoral man. And so she stood against the pressure of everybody that was important to her in her life in order to do what she thought was right. So Mansfield Park probably has the strongest moral emphasis of all the novels, although they all have a moral emphasis, I think.
And Mansfield Park, of course, is the novel that certainly in my experience of talking to people who read Jane Austen is probably now regarded as the least favorite. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, a lot of people really don't like Mansfield Park, although there are some around who love it. I've learned to love it by understanding better what the background was, what kind of issues were going on around that time, and just looking deeper at Fanny herself and seeing her strength of character, which is not a strength that we recognize as easily maybe today in our society, but she certainly was a woman of character.
Absolutely. And I read Mansfield Park. In fact, I think it's the last Jane Austen that I read. I read it earlier on this year, and yes,
Okay.
it's a good read. It was it was interesting to see the characters, and of course, you've got various church characters in Mansfield Park, and one of whom is, now I'm forgetting his name, but
Dr.
he was
Grant, maybe?
That's the one, Dr. Grant. Are you able to contrast Dr. Grant with Edmund Bertram?
Very much so. Dr. Grant was the kind of character that was parodied in satirical cartoons of the time, the clergyman who was considered greedy and gluttonous, and Jane Austen even has him die of overindulgence in the end when he gets his prebendal seat at Westminster. But Mary Crawford talks a lot about him and how terrible he is. But Edmund is not the same kind of person as Dr. Grant. So I think Jane Austen loved the church, and she was parodying the clergymen that she thought were stepping out of their place to appear what they should not appear, which is another quote from Mansfield Park. So she's showing us that there were clergymen like Dr. Grant, but Edmund also says they're not as common as is believed. When Mary Crawford says all clergymen are like that, he says, no, I don't think so. And I think that was Jane Austen's own opinion because of the example of her father and her brothers who were conscientious clergymen. And she actually knew over 100 clergymen personally in her life. So she had a wide range of knowing maybe the silly ones like Mr. Collins, or the gluttonous ones like Dr. Grant, but also the really solid ones like Edmund Bertram, Edward Ferrars, Henry Tilney, the ones that she made heroes of her novels. So she showed both kinds of clergymen.
Excellent. And of course, as you say, her father was himself a clergyman, and she knew well over 100 clergymen herself during her life. To what extent do you think that influence, that upbringing, that going to church regularly, in the various places that she lived, influenced her writing?
Well, it has to have influenced it, right? Because everything we are, everything we know influences what we write. That comes out of who we are and our experience. So I think it influenced her a lot. And you see it throughout her novels, because you see her clergymen, you see her discussions on the church and clergy. But she wrote, as several of her reviewers have said, she wrote by giving examples rather than by direct preaching. So in her novels, we see examples of what she thought was good moral behavior and what we still think is good moral behavior, contrasted with what was not. And so her beliefs about right and wrong, about good and bad, and about truth and lies, those all come out in her novels over and over.
So your assessment of her personal faith, what would that be based upon what you know of Jane Austen?
I think she had a very deep personal faith. As one of her friends said, she didn't show it off because of, her friend says, because of her being exposed to the kind of the current stereotypes of people who were overly emotional in expressing their faith. And she wasn't like that. She had more of a rational faith, but I think it was quite deep. She apparently, certainly she went to church regularly throughout her life. She wrote 3 beautiful prayers that really show that she had a deep faith. In fact, in one of them, she prays that we not be Christians in name only. So she did not want to be just a nominal Christian. She wanted it to be true to her heart. And I think it's expressed in her novels and in her letters. It shows what kind of person that she was. And I believe that she loved God deeply, and that comes out in what she says. But she doesn't state it outright, but she shows it.
Do you think that faith of hers played any part in her decision not to marry?
I think that probably, like her heroines, she would only marry a man that she really loved and respected. We see that, of course, very obviously in Pride and Prejudice, that Elizabeth is only going to marry a man that she loves and respects. And I think Jane Austen must have felt the same way. And maybe she didn't meet that man, or maybe that man didn't propose to her. Could have been, several people, but so that probably played an important part. I think we can wish that Jane Austen said more directly what she believed. I wonder sometimes if she believed that her writing was a calling from God and that that's what she was supposed to pursue, but she doesn't say that outright. So we can only imply it or imagine it. But it's possible that was part of her decision, that was because, of course, as many have commented, once she got married, it would have been a lot harder for her to produce these wonderful books. Not impossible, but harder. So we don't really know about what she personally thought about all that, but I think that at least we can say that she would have wanted to marry a man that she could respect and that she thought was of good character.
And that, then, by the sounds of it, and from what we know of, obviously she never got married, sort of outweighed the, if you like, Christian duty to get married and have children.
That's right. So I talk in my book about how, for instance, Elizabeth Bennet faced 2 opposing, maybe not opposing, but somewhat conflicting Christian duties: the duty to honor her parents and provide for them, which she could have done if she married Mr. Collins, or of course, Mr. Darcy, the first time he proposed, versus her duty to love and respect her husband, which is very clear also in scripture. And she chose the duty to love and respect her husband and said, I can't marry these men because I can't love and respect them. So there were different Christian duties there. And obviously Jane Austen valued the second one of loving and respecting her husband most. But she also gives us Charlotte Lucas, who valued the duty of providing for herself and her family first, and shows her as being pretty happy in her choice. So they were both following different religious duties. Yeah,
but both leading to a place of where they were happy with.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, talking about her faith and talking about her books, do you think there's a particular message that she was trying to, or messages that she was trying to convey? Was it purely an artistic endeavor, or was there a sense of, actually, there's something I want to say here to people? What do you think?
I think there were plenty of things that she wanted to say, and that do come through if we look at her novels closely, especially if we understand her times. But even without, I mean, there has to be something deeper for her books to be so popular for so long with so many people. Here we are more than 200 years after her life, and we're still reading and rereading her novels. This means that there's something in there that's deeper, that's worthwhile. It's not just light entertainment that she did to make money. Those kind of books have passed away. So we can see in any of her novels. So I've just been talking about Sense and Sensibility at our big annual general meeting for JASNA. And seeing the examples she gave in there of selfishness and self-denial. And so Willoughby, of course, shows complete selfishness, and it says that outright in the book. And of course, John and Fanny Dashwood are just hilarious but terrible examples of total selfishness, right? Not thinking about other people at all. And then there's Eleanor, who considers everything according to her Christian duty to love her neighbor as herself. And that totally governs her actions. And I think that Austen was giving us Eleanor as an example there of someone who is thinking about other people and not about herself. And she even gives us Marianne, who is totally self-absorbed, but then at the end has this time of repentance and of recognizing all the harm that she's been doing to other people. And she chooses to change. And so she gives us that example as well. And I think, in all of her books, there are messages, moral kind of messages. Now, of course, everyone who examines Jane Austen comes from their own perspective, and they come up with different messages from her books, which is one of the amazing things about her books, right? Is that we can find so many different things in it. But I do think that some of the most obvious things, like in Sense and Sensibility, are moral messages that she was showing us, not telling us.
Mm. So you mentioned, when we were talking about Dr. Grant, you mentioned about prebendary stall, I think was the term you use.
That's
and there's
right.
a whole load of other words that crop up relating to church at that time. I mean, obviously words like curate and rector and vicar we're reasonably familiar with, although probably a lot of people don't necessarily know the distinction. And there's a whole load of other terms as well. I mean, how much of the language separates the modern reader from Jane Austen's, from when she was writing 200 years ago?
Yeah, well, one of the things I've tried to do in my book is to define all those kind of words as they were used then, because even if you're an Anglican today, you're using the word rector differently than the way it was used in her time. So that's why there's a glossary in my book, as well as explanations of all those different things. But in terms of how much it separates us from that time, certainly you can read Jane Austen on many different levels. So you can read it and just ignore those things and go, okay, he was a rector, he was in the church, right? But I think you'll get a lot more nuances of what's going on if you really understand what the words meant. If you understand, for instance, that Mr. Elton being a vicar means that his income was a lot lower than a rector's income would have been. And so he was much more likely to need to marry a rich wife than what Emma cluelessly thought. So, and there's also words like exertion and principle and candor that had very religious meanings in that time. And if we understand how those words were used in that time, we can understand much more clearly what Jane Austen was saying by using those words.
So it seems to me that with the wealth of background material like that your book is ideal for anyone who is trying to write historically accurately. So if you're trying to write a historical novel set in the time of Jane Austen, the Regency, then your book is like almost an indispensable resource, really, for describing the church. Does that sound fair?
That is very fair. And that's another reason that I wrote it, because I enjoy reading those kind of novels. But often there are things that I go, she or he doesn't really understand what was going on here. And I understand why they don't understand it, because it was a lot of work to find that information. So I've tried to make it so that it's very easy to get to, so they can use that as a resource as they're writing and see. And also the book, so I spoke actually to the Regency Fiction Writers Conference some months ago, and they were very interested by all that I had to tell them about the church, because again, it's hard information to find, or it was hard information to find, but now it's not. So.
Excellent. I mean, one of the things that we are very is important to us with Regency history is going back to the original sources and actually reading what people wrote, what they were saying at the time, hearing their voices. So I'm guessing you've done quite a lot of that.
Yes, I've read a lot of primary sources. So fortunately nowadays, with archive.org and Google Books, a lot of things have been scanned, so you can read a lot of what was written during that time and dig through it and find the things that are relevant here. So yes, I've done a lot of that kind of research.
And you mentioned earlier on about Jane Austen's prayers, and I know you quote from some of her letters in your book.
Oh yeah.
Have you read every word that Jane Austen wrote? that still survive today?
As far as I know, multiple times.
Wow.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
some achievement. That's some achievement. So, I mean, is there anything that was particularly amusing to you as you went through this? Anything that stood out to you as particularly, made you laugh?
Yeah, my favorite example is when Mr. Collins, when Elizabeth is confronting Mr. Collins about whether he's going to dance at the ball, and he says that he doesn't think that Lady Catherine or the Archbishop would object to that. And I think it's very funny because the Archbishop, of course, was over the whole Church of England and would not even have known that Mr. Collins existed. And yet he's thinking that the Archbishop is going to care whether he dances or not. And also the fact that he takes Lady Catherine, his patroness, and puts her on the same level as the Archbishop over the whole Church of England. I found that very entertaining.
Yeah, and I guess there are quite a few other jokes in Jane Austen that that are probably lost on us today.
Yeah, I think so.
Are there any other church-related humor that you think is, where Jane Austen is poking fun at the church? I mean, obviously in some of the characters, Mr. Elton and Mr. Collins, she's giving a good sort of poke there at them. Are there any others? Yes.
Well, of course, Dr. Grant, like getting this prebendal stall, which was a prestigious and financially rewarding church position where he probably didn't have to do much, but getting that and then dying after 3 great institutionary dinners in 1 week. Again, this is a big poke at the church, especially at the top hierarchy of the church. And she does give a contrast between that and then, of course, in Persuasion, Charles Hayter, who's a curate, which was the lowest rung of the church, who couldn't even afford to marry. So she shows those things, but she does them in humorous ways. So
your book doesn't just talk about Jane Austen.
That's true.
It's as we've already seen, it's a sizable volume. There's a lot there, and you give a much broader picture of the background for the church generally, and you talk about some other characters. Jane Austen, I'm assuming, may not have met all of them. Probably didn't meet all of them. Actually.
That's true. That's true.
So are there any particular favorites? Well, do you want to just mention some of them and then maybe pick out a particular favorite you want to say a few words about? You've already mentioned the Countess of Huntingdon?
Countess of Huntingdon and Hannah More were two of my favorites. Each person that I write about in the book, I actually read several books about that person and really got deep into their lives and found them quite fascinating, which is why I put them in the book. So, of course, there's a lot about William Wilberforce, who led the fight against slavery and as well as the fight to reform the manners of England. Manners, by the way, is a very interesting word, and Edmund Bertram just defines it for us as moral behavior. And that's what he was trying to fix, was not just the politeness, but the real manners. John and Charles Wesley, of course, were fascinating people. It was very interesting to read John Wesley's journals and find out some of the things that he experienced. But Charles Wesley, who wrote thousands of hymns, is also an amazing character, because this was a time when hymns were just being introduced into the church. And to us now, hymns are so basic a part of worship, right? But they were just introducing that in that time. And Charles Wesley was a big part of that. What other people? Elizabeth Fry, who was a Quaker minister. The Quakers, of course, allowed women ministers as well as men. And she led the fight to reform the prisons of England and just did some really amazing things for a woman with a number of children and ill health. And yet she, I think, was the first woman to actually testify before Parliament. And she changed Newgate Prison, made it just a totally different kind of environment. So there were a lot of people who just had an amazing impact on the world. If I look through my my book here, John Newton, William Cooper, Jane Austen's beloved poet, he fascinates me because of his deep struggles with depression, but he still produced this amazing poetry that was very, very popular in Jane Austen's time and before and after. So there were a whole series of people who just changed their world during this time. So those are the kind of people that I've included in my book.
Obviously, Jane Austen's time was a time of massive change.
Yes.
The Industrial Revolution was just getting going. The whole thing about whether you marry for love or whether you marry for money was really quite a change in a lot of society.
Yes.
What sort of challenges were facing the Church of England in Jane Austen's time?
Well, of course, they had to deal with all those changes in society. So the Industrial Revolution was bringing a lot of people into cities, sometimes new cities, which had very few churches. And at this time, well, I guess in all times, but anyway, the Church of England was a state church, and Parliament had to actually make a law in order to build new churches. So they had all these places without enough churches, with lots of people, and people who didn't have time to go to church. I mean, they were working very intense jobs, and just things had totally changed from the community aspect that Jane Austen describes so well. Like in Emma's Highbury, we see this community, and they're all interconnected, and the clergyman is really at the heart of that community. But with the Industrial Revolution, people moving to these new cities, that wasn't happening at all. So that was a major challenge for the church, like how to reach out to those people. And the Methodists actually did a much better job than the mainstream Church of England. They were in the Church of England, of course, till the end of the 1700s, but they went out and did open air preaching to these people, and they set them up in small groups to follow up afterwards, and just did an amazing job of outreach. But the mainstream Church of England rejected them. They didn't like that solution, but so the Methodists were a challenge to the church. There were also all these structural challenges, which Jane Austen describes, like people getting a position as minister simply because of what they knew, not because of what kind of person they were or whether they cared about God or not. It was more of a way to make money. So I have a whole chapter on that in the book about whether the clergy was a duty or a calling. That was a difficult thing at that time. The evangelical movement was rising up within the church, and brought about, I think, what were some very good changes in the church. For instance, making sure that clergymen did have a calling and that they wanted to serve God and people and not just serve themselves. That was a major thing that was happening in the church, to deal with some of these challenges in the whole way that the church was set up. And of course, many things changed in the following century.
Just a question that's just occurred to me, actually, and because I haven't seen any reference to it in your book, so it may forgive me if I've missed it. But obviously, Britain was at war with France for pretty much most of Jane Austen's life. Does that in any way impact? Does that feed through to your book and anything you're talking about with regards to church?
It does, and it's actually in that same chapter that I was just mentioning. The French Revolution, which was the beginning of all that, brought this fear to England that the same thing could happen there because it was so violent. So many of the nobility were killed. And they believed that had happened to France because they were not following God. And so there are quotes of the time about how the nobility and all their carriages were going to church, and the poor people were wondering what's going on. But it was because they believed that if they didn't turn back to God, that their country was going to be ruined, like France, that the same kind of thing was going to happen there. So that was a huge impact, really, on the church, the French Revolution. It also made them more afraid of change, of enthusiasm, which was their word for any kind of emotional display of religion.
Yes.
They were afraid that a lot of those things would lead to violent revolution. And so that affected a lot of things in how the church was dealing with society.
So I guess that kept the Church of England very middle of the road. Is that fair to say? Middle
of the road. It even affected the fight against slavery, because there was this idea, if we free the slaves in our dominions, then the French are going to have an advantage because they're still going to have these slaves and be producing all this sugar and getting all this money and stuff. So it really affected a lot of aspects of what the church was doing in Austen's England. Yeah, Christians were leading a lot of campaigns during this time against cruelty of all kinds. And one of the things was cruelty to animals. And so I've talked about that in my book. One of my favorite stories about Wilberforce is when he was in Bath one time and he saw a guy whipping his horse to try to get it to go up the hill, and Wilberforce got down from his carriage and went and shouted at this guy, and the guy was getting really mad, and then his friend said, "That's Wilberforce," and he was like, oh oh, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. And went on his way. So these Christians, especially in the evangelical movement, did have a really powerful effect on society. I think it's just one of the things I'm trying to show in the book is just how much Christians at this time were able to change the world. And they did that based on their religious beliefs, their beliefs in what God wanted from them and from society. And they were able to spread those beliefs until society really changed. I mean, the Victorian era is very different from the Regency. It had its flaws and problems as well. But in terms of people trying to act morally, or at least sometimes pretending to, but it was fashionable by then to act in moral ways and to care about other people and to try to make things better in the world. And that was a huge difference from the Regency time. And so it inspires me to see how Christians of this time were actually able to change their world, and they would be the first to say that that was through God working in them and God working in the world. So yeah, I would like people to read those inspiring examples, because I think they're good for us to read today as well.
So your book, Fashionable Goodness, Christianity in Jane Austen's England, is available. And certainly I recommend it to anybody who's interested, who's read Jane Austen, considers themselves a fan of Jane Austen, and really wants to better understand what's going on, or wants to write Regency novels, which have got or even non-fiction, which have got a really solid grounding in fact, and of course church permeated that life at that time. Then yeah, certainly get hold of Brenda's book. It's available on Kindle and also in print form. So thank you again, Brenda. It's been really good to talk to you. Thank you for sharing some of your enthusiasm and knowledge, and I trust that those who've watched it have found it useful and engaging and will come and look you up. Where can they find you, Brenda?
Well, I have a blog. It's called Faith, Science, Joy, and Jane Austen, because actually science is another interest I have. I hadn't really mentioned that, but there is a chapter in the book on faith and science and their connections during that day. So they can find me there. That's brendascox.wordpress.com. Or they can find me on Jane Austen's World, which I write for regularly and I'm very involved in. And they can find my book on Amazon and at Jane Austen Books. So
excellent. And are you on any of the social media channels?
I'm on Facebook. I have an author page on Facebook, and I'm quite involved there. That's the main thing I do.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I encourage people to look you up on there. Okay,
thank you.
so
find me under Brenda S Cox. So,
Brenda S Cox.
There are too many Brenda Coxes on Facebook. So.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you, Brenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I've enjoyed the time. Thanks.